All right, everybody, let's dive deep, shall we? Today, we're taking a look at excerpts from a book with a title you won't soon forget, The Criminal History of the Papacy by Tony Bushby.
He doesn't hold back, that's for sure.
No, he does not. And, we often think of the papacy as, well, all about piety and spiritual guidance.
Right, holiness and all that.
Exactly. But as we're going to see, the truth, as always it seems, is a little more, let's just say, complicated.
It's a wild ride. Buckle up.
Okay, so Bushby takes us through some pretty intense chapters in the church's history, and we're going to follow his lead. Let's start with the 10th century. Now, this period is often called the Rule of the Whores, and no, that's not some made-up tabloid name. It really reflects how much power two women, Theodora and her daughter Marozia, had during this time.
They were a force to be reckoned with.
And here's the thing, these women, they weren't even part of the clergy, and reportedly, they couldn't even read or write. But they were calling the shots, at least indirectly, when it came to the papacy. What does that tell you about power back then? That being, officially qualified and literate wasn't exactly a requirement for pulling the string.
It tells us that the official lines of authority, they only tell part of the story, for sure.
Right, like what other hidden power dynamics were at work back then makes you think.
Yeah.
But that's nothing compared to what Bushby tells us about Pope John XII. This guy was pope in the mid-10th century, and let's just say he was not exactly a model of piety.
Understatement of the year.
Here you have the head of the Catholic Church, gambling, messing around with pagan rituals, and get this, allegedly running a brothel. Out of the Lateran Palace, no less.
Talk about a conflict of interests.
Right. How on earth did someone like that hold on to power?
Well, you got to remember, being pope back then, it was a risky job. Lots of them died young, under mysterious circumstances. Short reigns were the norm. Maybe all that danger encouraged some, shall we say, live fast, die young kind of thinking.
I guess when you put it that way.
Yeah.
But speaking of shocking papal behavior, the story of Pope Benedict IX in the 11th century takes the cake. This pope, he did something so audacious, so unbelievable, that it still boggles the mind. He sold the papacy.
The whole kit and caboodle?
The whole thing.
Wow. Just wow. I mean, I know simony, buying and selling religious offices, was pretty rampant back then. Shows you how much greed had infected the church. They were willing to exploit their spiritual authority for a quick buck. But Benedict IX, he took it to a whole new level.
No kidding. Blurred the lines is an understatement. And the 11th and 12th centuries, they were wild times. I mean, we're talking corruption, but also these massive schisms in the church. We're talking multiple people all claiming to be the one true pope.
Oh yeah, for centuries. That whole idea of an unbroken line of popes, each one inheriting the authority of St. Peter himself, it all went out the window.
The very foundation of the church, completely up for grabs.
Exactly.
And, these weren't just some theological debates, happening in Ivory Tower somewhere. Oh, no, these power struggles, they had real consequences. They could drag entire regions into wars.
Absolutely. A prime example is Pope Honorius II, early 12th century. He launches this crusade, right? But not against, I don't know, some far-off enemy. Nope. He goes after his own city, Rome.
A pope going to war with his own people? I mean, can you imagine the headlines today? But back then, it shows you how intense these power grabs were. What was it all about, though?
Control. Control of Rome meant controlling everything, resources, political clout, you name it. Plus the symbolic power, right? Holding the seat of the church, it was a prize worth fighting for, even if you had to fight your own people for it, apparently.
And these rivalries, they could last for generations, like a really messed up family feud. Take Anacletus II and Innocent II, for example, both elected pope on the very same day.
Talk about a divided church. That election sparked what some historians call the 50-year war, literally half a century of infighting, all because of these competing claims to the papacy. You can just picture it, right? These powerful families choosing sides, each one backing their pope. It's almost Shakespearean, all their ambitions and grudges playing out on this grand, holy stage. And it shows how intertwined religion and politics were. Faith rarely exists in a vacuum, does it? Especially not back then.
Bushby doesn't shy away from the church's dark side either. He really goes into detail about their persecution of anyone they considered heretics. The Cathars in the 12th and 13th centuries, that's a particularly brutal chapter. So who were the Cathars, and why were they public enemy number one to the church?
The Cathars were a religious group. They were mostly concentrated in Europe, particularly in what we now call southern France. And their beliefs, well, let's just say they clashed with Catholic dogma, and not just on minor points either. They believed in a simpler, more stripped-down version of Christianity. and they rejected a lot of the church's hierarchies and practices. Basically, they were like, thanks, but no thanks. We'll handle our relationship with God ourselves.
So they were challenging the church's authority, theologically speaking. But it wasn't just about ideas, was it? Their beliefs threatened the church's wealth and power structure, too.
Right. Bingo. By emphasizing personal piety and rejecting all the fancy rituals, the Cathars were directly undermining the church's control over people's spiritual lives. And to top it off, they were questioning the need for all the church's wealth, all those lands, all those riches. The Cathars basically said, what's all that about?
So a threat on multiple fronts then, spiritual and financial, and the church's response. But as brutal as you can get.
Understatement. The church launched the Albigensian Crusade, a decades-long campaign to wipe out the Cathars, and their justification. They were defending the true faith, eliminating heresy. But to a lot of people, it looked a lot more like religious intolerance and power-grabbing, plain and simple.
And that brings us to the massacre at Béziers in 1209. That event really drives home how brutal this period was.
It's a bloodbath. The Crusaders, backed by the Pope himself, they storm into Béziers and they just start slaughtering people. Thousands dead, men, women, children. It didn't matter. Cathar or not, they didn't discriminate.
It's tough to square that level of savagery with, well, with the teachings of Christ. Love thy neighbor takes on a whole new meaning there. The whole Cathar crusade is just a stark reminder of what happens when religious intolerance is let loose. Power corrupts.
And the fallout from that crusade, it was enormous. Entire regions were decimated, villages wiped out, a whole culture almost erased. It's a cautionary tale, about what happens when power goes unchecked, about how easily religious zeal can be used for, well, let's just say less than holy purposes.
And this wasn't some isolated incident of the church throwing its weight around. It seems like they were involved in violence throughout their history.
It's true. For a big chunk of history, the church, it was a major player in the whole war and conquest game. They had land, they had armies, and they weren't afraid to use them.
It's easy to forget that side of the church, We tend to focus on the spiritual side, the moral authority, all that. But they were a political and military force, too.
Exactly. For a lot of the medieval period, there wasn't really a clear line between religious power and worldly power. The papacy, with all its wealth and influence, they played the game just like any king or emperor.
They even had their own navy for a while there, the Papal Navy. Imagine pitching that today.
Right. It definitely makes you rethink that whole image of the church as this purely spiritual entity. They were a force to be reckoned with, in more ways than one.
It's a lot to take in when you really think about it. All this corruption, all this violence, all these power games, makes you wonder about the whole, spiritual foundation of the church.
Yeah, it's a tough one to reconcile, isn't it? I mean, the church's actions versus its supposed ideals. It's a constant theme throughout their history.
How do you square that circle, though? Preaching love and forgiveness while you're off on crusades, carrying out inquisitions.
It's a contradiction, for sure. On the one hand, you've got Jesus talking about compassion, humility, turning the other cheek. On the other, you've got this institution, this church, amassing power, wealth, crushing anyone who disagrees with them.
It's like they skipped a few chapters in the Gospels, wouldn't you say?
It makes you think about institutions in general, right? Even the ones that start with good intentions, religious or not, they're run by people, and people are, well, people. The papacy, it's full of saints and sinners, just like the rest of us, I guess.
It certainly puts a different spin on that whole idea of an unbroken line of popes, each one a direct descendant from St. Peter, with some kind of divine authority passed down. This history, it paints a different picture.
A much messier picture, for sure. Bushby, he's not the only one saying this. Plenty of historians have pointed out that the whole idea of papal succession, it's not as neat and tidy as the church likes to make out. There were fights, rival popes, even times when there was no pope at all.
So where does that leave us? What have we learned from this deep dive into, shall we say, the less holy side of the papacy?
Well, for me, the big takeaway is this. Don't take anything at face value, especially when it comes to institutions, powerful institutions, the ones that claim some kind of moral authority. The papacy, it's a prime example. Just because they're the church doesn't mean they're always right or that they always have the high ground.
And that's a lesson that feels pretty relevant today. You know what I mean? We're bombarded with information these days, but it's not always easy to tell what's true, what's spin. You really got to be careful, look at things from all angles.
Exactly. Don't just accept the official narrative. Dig a little deeper, like we did today. Look for those hidden stories, those uncomfortable truths. That's how you get a real understanding of the past and how it shapes the present.
And maybe, just maybe, by understanding how power has been used and abused in the past, we can be a little bit savvier about how it's being used today, whether it's coming from a religious institution, a government, or frankly, anyone trying to tell us what to think.
The past is never really past, right? It's always there, whispering to us if we're willing to listen.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder all of this. The papacy, it's a wild ride, full of intrigue, drama, and more than a few skeletons in the closet. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.